When it comes to the work of evangelization or spreading the good news, I think we all know that it's important, and even we might know on top of that it's an essential part of the church's mission. The mission, of course, of the church being to make disciples of all nations. But when it comes to our participation in it, when it comes to my participation in spreading the good news, sometimes there's a certain intimidation factor, right? We're not really chomping at the bit to evangelize our neighbor, whoever our neighbor might be. So what I want to do today is kind of address that particular issue. So common reasons why we might be afraid to evangelize or spread the good news, and address each of those different concerns. So one really kind of popular concern that comes up in this regard, people sometimes say to themselves at least, gosh, I'm afraid of evangelizing, I'm afraid of spreading the good news to my neighbor because, gosh, I don't really know my stuff. And so the concern is gosh, if a certain thing comes up, a certain question, a certain topic, a certain issue, I wouldn't know what to say. I wouldn't know how to say it in a way which is compelling and convincing, if you will, right? So I don't really know my stuff. Now, as an important starting point, it's important to recognize that regardless of who you are, regardless of how long you've been Catholic, it's always a valid option. It's always a valid option to say, look, I don't know the answer. Can I look it up and get back to you, right? That's really always a valid option, regardless of whether you're a novice when it comes to the Catholic thing or you've been evangelizing for years. I don't know the answer, I'm going to look it up, can I get back to you? Most people of goodwill will receive that particular answer. It's a lot better than bluffing. It's a lot better than bluffing. A lot of times we bluff. We can all relate to this, right? A lot of times we give an answer which is kind of right, kind of wrong, which makes it totally wrong because it's not 100% right, We do it all the time, right? So it's wrong just enough, so it's not right. So don't bluff. Don't bluff. It's okay to say, look, I'll get back to you for an actual answer, right? But more to the point, a lot of times whenever this particular issue comes up, I'm afraid because I don't know my stuff, the real response is you probably don't. Most people, even though they've been Catholic for a long time, don't really know their stuff that well to the point at which they can evangelize in terms of not just knowing the correct answer, but being able to explain it in a way which is compelling and flexible. Depending on a particular situation, depending on who you're talking to, depending on how much time you have, right? So flexibility, not simply the right answer, right? It goes to this really important distinction, right? There's evangelization on the one hand and pre-evangelization on the other. And they're very different things, but both are important. So evangelization, evangelion, right? So it's talking about the good news. So strictly speaking, evangelization is proclaiming the good news. The good news of what? The Lord's resurrection from the dead. And so because Jesus Christ came back from the dead, what that means is that everything he said about himself is true. He is the Lord. He is the Lord our God. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the one who conquered sin and death, right? So the resurrection. And so by extension, we're called to declare the lordship of Jesus Christ, right? The positive and negative aspects of evangelization. Anything which is consistent with the gospel, anything which is authentically good and true and beautiful, we affirm that, we celebrate that, we encourage that. But at the same time, things which are not, obviously we point that out too. So the negative aspect of evangelization, right? So everything I just described, that technically speaking is evangelization. Everything which comes before technically is pre-evangelization. And that's important too, but technically speaking, it is not evangelization. So what does that include? Being nice, being kind, being welcoming, building a relationship with the other person, journeying with the other person, meeting the person where they're at, right? And preparing yourself for the task at hand. So where are there gaps in terms of my faith knowledge which inhibit me from becoming an effective evangelist? So what I want to do at this point is recommend a couple resources for you, right? So podcasts and books, right? So these are podcasts which specifically touch on the area of apologetics. Apologetics, of course, is explaining the faith from a rational standpoint. So just to name a couple, right? So Word on Fire Show, Bishop Robert Barron, that's very good. Catechism in a Year by Father Mike Schmitz, really popular podcast. Council of Trent, council as an advice as opposed to a meeting, right? So Council of Trent by Trent Horn. And one of my personal favorites, Catholic Answers Focus. So all those are very good from a catechetical and apologetic standpoint. Now, in terms of books, the world's your oyster, but one particular resource I came across quite recently, actually, is called the Ultimate Apologist's Reading List by Trent Horn. And it's just a list of all sorts of really amazing books for your own edification and also, obviously, for the purpose of evangelization. So if you look at the show notes for this episode of the podcast, you'll see all those different resources, and we'll have that also in the bulletin when we leave church today. So there's that. Okay. So that's the kind of first concern. I'm afraid because I don't know my faith, right? Now, the second concern is like, okay, look, I'm afraid because I don't want to offend other people. I'm afraid because I don't want to offend other people. Certainly, you need to be mindful not just of what you're selling, but the packaging as well. Not just what you say, but when you say it and how you say it. So that's just being prudent. That's just being smart, right? So certainly, it goes to this thing we talked about before. It's not good enough to simply proclaim the truth with clarity. You also need to proclaim it with charity. So that's really important. But timing is important as well. And Bishop Barron talks about this, right? So he talks about in terms of like limited experiences. When people come face to face with their own limitation of simply being human, right? So, for example, when I encounter suffering, when I encounter failure, when I encounter death, when I encounter the inherent limitations of wealth, pleasure, power, and honor in terms of satisfying the deep desires of my heart. It's not to say you're trying to take advantage of people in their positions of vulnerability, but simply to say that there are certain moments where people are more open to the reality of God than other moments. And an important task of being an evangelist, you got to recognize those opportunities and kind of rise to the occasion. Now, a corresponding point, there's this thing called Affirmative Orthodoxy. Kind of a fancy term, but basically what it is you got to make sure when people receive the gospel message or the gospel truth, their lingering experience is that that's a gift. Now, certainly the gospel always involves the cross, right? So some form of self-denial, some form of like saying no to certain things, some manner of dying to oneself. If you don't have that in terms of like the gospel pitch, it's not the gospel, right? But at the same time, like it's not like Good Friday full stop, it's always Good Friday leading to Easter Sunday. It's never no full stop, it's always no in favor of a greater yes. And so that should be the lingering experience of the person who receives the gospel from your lips. It's a challenging truth, which the gospel is, but I receive it as a gift, which the gospel is fundamentally speaking, right? Okay, so I don't know my faith, I'm worried about offending people. The last thing, this is not really something we tend to think ourselves, but this is something imposed to us from the world. So ironically, it's like, I'm afraid because I'm worried about imposing my views on other people. That's the way it's phrased. So to frame the issue, I really love fried chicken. I've been holding back on that because I mentioned that once in a particular parish setting. And then every birthday I had and every Christmas, people were giving me buckets of KFC and gift certificates. And they thought individually they were being very clever and ironic, whereas actually they were putting them on a rocket ship to hotel heart disease, right? So I do love it though. So I love fried chicken. I love hockey too. But these things are what we might call subjectively satisfying, right? I never feel compelled to evangelize on behalf of fried chicken, right? So I like it. You don't have to like it, right? You don't have to like it as much as me, right? I don't feel compelled to evangelize on behalf of fried chicken because it's merely subjectively satisfying. And a whole bunch of things fall in that category, but religion is not in that category. Religion is not like football or fried chicken or hockey, right? So it actually matters whether or not you believe that God is real. It matters whether or not God is real. It matters whether or not this is His church. It matters whether or not the commandments actually lead to authentic human flourishing, because these things are objectively valuable. To give you an analogy, imagine you're parents with young kids. Maybe you are a parent with young kids, right? If you wait to give your kids vegetables until they're fully convicted of the nutritional value of vegetables, they will die, right? Because vegetables are objectively valuable, right? And so what's true of carrots and broccoli is all the more true of the Almighty God. Okay, so there's that. Now, so far we've been talking about like concerns and addressing them from a rational standpoint, but it's important to look at the gospel, always. What does the gospel say about any topic, but about this particular topic? And a lot of times, as is typical of the gospel, it's not necessarily what you might expect. It's unexpected, it is provocative, it's the gospel. That's the nature of the gospel, right? So Gospel of Matthew chapter 10, one of the more relevant passages in this regard. So the Lord isn't just talking about fear. He's talking about fear with regards to religious persecution. So before, I call you disciples, but now you're sent forth. That's why they're called apostles, right? And so with regards to these people who are sent forth to proclaim the good news, He's preparing their hearts for that which is to come, right? You will face religious persecution, persecution from all different fronts. So what I say to you is, don't be afraid, obviously, but why? Because nothing covered will be left uncovered. Nothing secret will be left hidden. And so you think, that's weird. Why am I supposed to be not afraid because of those reasons? Now, the obvious thing is, the end times. At the end of time, in the fullness of time, Christ will reveal Himself to have always been the master of time and space, the master of all things, right? He was always in control, right? Even and especially in the dark times. Truth will win out at the end, and so therefore you don't have to worry about losing an occasional battle because Christ has won the war. So that's a pretty obvious thing. You don't need massive exegetical skills to unpack that particular nugget, right? But the key to understanding this passage is to be attentive to a translation issue, right? So the word which is rendered here as uncovered, there'll be nothing covered which is left uncovered. It's actually a word which is used in the original Greek to describe the lifting of the veil of a bride on her wedding day, which tells us, okay, like, don't be afraid. And why? Because you, as a member of God's Holy Catholic Church, are the bride of Jesus Christ, where Jesus Christ is the bridegroom. And because of that ontological reality, you must not fret, and you must never be afraid. I was trying to think of a way to illustrate this point which made it concrete from an emotional standpoint. And movies, God bless them, right? So I saw this movie just recently called SpiderMan Across the Spider-Verse. It's about SpiderMan crossing the Spider-Verse, which means that the plot doesn't matter, right? So Spider-Man obviously is a superhero. And basically in the context of this movie, he's this little boy. His alter ego is Miles Morales. And he's talking to his mother. And his mother doesn't know that he's Spider-Man, right? And so they're having this really interesting conversation. And for my money, it's the best scene in the movie. It doesn't really spoil the thing, so I don't mind sharing with you. But basically, the mother is struggling with this thing that all parents go through. This tension where, like, look, he will always be my little boy. He'll always be my little boy. And so my desire always is to keep him safe, to always protect him, to make sure no one hurts this little boy. So no matter how old this person is, this person is always my little boy. But at the same time, I recognize that an important part of growing up and becoming mature and becoming a man, I got to let this little boy go out into the world and spread his wings. And with that, there's going to be what you might expect. Successes, failures, acceptance, rejection, try again, try again, try again. But that's a big part of just being a parent. You got to just let that thing play out while at the same time remaining mom or dad, right? And so here's this moment, right, where the mother's talking to her son, and it's really interesting the way it's phrased. Like, she frames it in terms of like the third person. So whoever wrote this scene, kudos and accolades, right? But basically, just to paraphrase. So she's talking to her son, Miles Morales, and she's like, look, for years I've been taking care of this little boy, making sure that he always feels loved, and he always feels like he belongs, but now he wants to go out into the world, and he wants to do great big things. And what I'm worried about is that the people out there in the world, they won't look out for you in the way that we do. They won't root for you the way that we do. They won't cheer for you in the way that we do. So here's the deal. You got to promise me that you're going to look out for this little boy, right? You got to promise me that you're going to look out for this little boy, right? Make sure that he never forgets where he came from. Make sure he never doubts that he's loved. And make sure that he doesn't let anyone in those big fancy places tell him that he doesn't belong, right? And this whole time, like Miles Morales, the kid, he's looking at his mom, he's got this little smile. And then the mom becomes slightly more serious and firm. And she's like, no, Miles, you gotta promise me. You gotta promise me you will never be lost. And he's like, okay, I promise, When I was watching it on a Sunday afternoon, I thought, hey, that's a great way to explain the Gospel of Matthew chapter 10, right? Ties a little bow in this thing we're talking about here, right? The Lord knows full well, He is sending us out like sheep in the midst of wolves. The Lord knows full well He is sending us out like sheep in the midst of wolves. He knows, obviously, it is extremely difficult, especially in this cultural setting, to live your faith with authenticity. Never mind, proclaim the good news boldly. But at the same time, He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, because in a way which remains hidden from the world, in a way which remains veiled before the world, you are a child of God and the beloved bride of Jesus Christ. And so even though you might go through this world and people will reject you and persecute you and misunderstand you, and your heart will ache for a whole variety of different reasons, you must never allow yourself to be lost. And never allow yourself to be convinced that you're less. Because God loves you. And that's all that matters.